Hello and welcome to Student Affairs Live. I'm your host, Tony Doody, and I'm pleased to be joining you from my professional home at Rutgers University. We broadcast on the Higher Ed Live network. You can tune into Student Affairs Live along with my brilliant friend and co-host, Heather Shea, Wednesdays at 1 o'clock Eastern Time. In a moment, I'll introduce you to our guests, but we can't do that without first giving a shout out to the sponsors that make Student Affairs Live possible. Higher Ed Live is produced by M. Stoner, a digital-first agency committed to tailored solutions that drive real results. Looking for an opportunity to tell your students' stories better? M. Stoner offers an 8-course on-demand series covering the essential elements of digital storytelling. Interested in learning more? We're tweeting out a link shortly with registration details. This broadcast is also sponsored by ACPA, College Student Educators International. Support for Student Affairs Live is one of the many ways ACPA provides innovative professional development. Visit myacpa.org to discover additional personal and professional development opportunities. I want to take a moment also to thank Kate Zulo and Robin Janice, who are helping to monitor the back channel and forwarding to me your best content and questions from the Twitterverse. And finally, I'm very honored to have joined us today a great panel, Loren Rullman, Beth McCuskey, and Timothy Davis. So I'd like to start off by having you all briefly introduce yourself with your current role and why in particular this topic is important to you. Let's start off with you, Beth.
Certainly. My name is Beth McCuskey. I'm the Vice Provost for Student Life at Purdue University. And I just think that the whole planning topic is good and where we must all be hanging our hats to drive the change that's necessary to educate the students today and in the future. Excellent.
All right. Loren, you're up.
Hi, Tony and everybody. My name is Loren Rullman. I spent 30 years in higher education, most recently as Associate Vice President for Student Life at the University of Michigan, where I spent 12 years. In July, just a few months ago, I moved from working in higher education to working for higher education. I now lead the higher education consulting practice for Workshop Studios, which is a design and strategy firm with offices in Milwaukee and Ann Arbor.
Excellent. All right, Tim.
Hi, Tony. Hi, everyone. My name is Tim Davis, and I'm the Executive Director for Student Resilience and Leadership Development at the University of Virginia. This topic, to me, is where everything comes together. I've been interested in the psychology of leadership for years, both as a person in industry and in higher ed, and this is where leaders really do their stuff and make an impact on the organizations they lead. So it's by nature really of interest to me.
Great. Now, I want everyone to be talking from a similar foundation and make sure that we're using common language that we can all understand. So, Loren, can you briefly distinguish between a few terms like organizational planning, strategic plan, reorganizations, and business plans?
Sure. Yeah, I kind of think of the strategic plan as the road map, if you will, the destination document. It essentially focuses the organization on the future. It establishes priorities and paths and really galvanizes people towards some kind of common purpose. So that's the strategic plan. The organizational plan is the way you operationalize those goals and those pathways. You might have, for example, a technology plan. You might have a diversity plan. You might have a staffing plan, an enrollment plan, a facility plan. So the organizational plan is the way you operationalize what you're trying to get done with a strategic plan. A business plan is a decision-making tool. It's a statement, if you will, of your business goals. Quite frankly, is probably most useful in the private sector where investors or lenders are trying to understand if you have a path, if you understand your market, and if you can be competitive. I think there's some utility on a campus, particularly for auxiliary enterprise, dining operations, for example, but it's essentially a statement of your business goals. And a reorganization, I suppose, Tony, in its simplest form, is an overhaul of your internal structure. It's hopefully for a good purpose and with really good thought and rationale to it. That said, though, I will say that most of these kinds of plans end up being documents or on paper. And, I think it was Eisenhower who said plans are useless, planning is indispensable. So perhaps the real value to this, to me anyways, is the process of thinking and deciding and choosing and galvanizing people towards some common purpose.
Oh, I like that. All right. So, Beth, the next question for you. Why does or should most organizational change and planning occur?
Wow. And I just think Loren really answered that with his last statement there. It's really about galvanizing people towards some common vision. I think sometimes this happens for a variety of reasons. First, it may be environmental. So as an institution, we are looking at the external and internal environments and determining, are we positioned to manage the things that we foresee likely to happen in the future? Another area that we plan is for aspirational or change, trying to become better at what we do. And that's one of the spaces where we can invest a ton of time and effort, really trying to position ourselves in whatever direction we're interested in for our campus and our future. I think sometimes too, and this is just the the way things work. Anytime there's a change in leadership, there's typically a change in plans, and so that's just one of the things that I think within higher ed we have to become accustomed to, because there are changes that occur regularly in terms of senior leadership on campus, and typically when that occurs, individuals are brought in for some change, and you're being brought to the table to help assist with that effort.
Great. And keeping on this line of thought, Tim, this next question for you. Ideally, who's the best person in the organization to lead change, and what are some of the traits and competencies that would make them more effective?
Yeah, sure, Tony. This is going to sound crazily simple, but meaningful organizational change can't happen without the full support of the leader at the very top of the organization. And while that sounds simple, I've seen many mistakes where leaders who are not at the very top rung think they can lead a divisional change without the input of or the buy-in of the overall leader. So the leader at the top of the organization has to lead the change. And the other important piece of that is that person has to be surrounded by a powerful coalition of others, right? The one person can't drive change through a large organization. In terms of the competencies, I think one really important one is the ability to concisely and meaningfully state the vision for change. I think John Cotter said, whenever you cannot describe the vision driving a change initiative within 5 minutes and get a reaction that signifies both an understanding and an interest in the change, you're in trouble. Briefly, as a psychologist, this is my bent on things, but I think also the important set of competencies are in the realm of EQ and the ability to develop trusting relationships with your team so that your team members can say, I'm not bought in. I don't see it that way. And when that happens, the leader's got to have the ego strength to praise the individual who's pushing back and work from there in terms of creating the buy-in.
I love it. I love it. Great foundation. Great setup for the rest of the conversation. So I'm going to throw this out here, and I did share this quote with all of you beforehand. I'm sure it made you smile. Gaius Petronius, Roman ruler from 66 AD, identified one of my pet peeves when it comes to change. He wrote, "We trained hard, but it seems every time we were beginning to form up into teams, we were reorganized. I was learned later in life that we tend to meet any situation by reorganizing. And what a wonderful method it can be for creating the illusion of progress while producing confusion, inefficiency, and demoralization." So when I talk to colleagues around the nation, it seems like many people are talking about similar organizational change issues. Reorganization, task forces, external reviews seem to be like a rite of passage. And Beth, you mentioned this for people who are taking on new roles. Is this part of a new culture, a new playbook for leadership management practice? Or has this always been the case, or at least in your experience? Beth, maybe you can take this.
I certainly jump in there. I do think that we have done this for a long time in terms of planning, in terms of reorganizations, in terms of self-assessments or external reviews. I mean, the CAS standards were created in the mid-1980s, for example. I do think what has changed today, though, is the speed of change. And a lot of that has to do with, as I mentioned before, the changing of the Guard and senior leadership roles in institutions. I also think that higher education is under pressure in ways that we have not seen in a long, long time. And so when the media is questioning the value of higher education and a degree, and individuals are taking shots at, you know, I graduated and I can't get a better job than somebody who went to the same job right out of high school, that puts us in the position of having to defend things, and that ramps us up. That turns up the heat in terms of making a difference. And so I think the tools and techniques have always been around, at least in some form, but the energy around them is certainly different today than it would have been, 20, 30 years ago.
You know, could I just add one thought, Tony, too? You know, I'm not sure that this is a new thing necessarily. Certainly the pace and the extent to which we're getting information about the context for change is faster and more frequent. But, you know, Tim's point about leadership and his interest in it is sort of the way I come at this, too. I'm quite interested in leaders and leadership, and believe that leaders have to have some intuitive sense, this EQ thing that Tim mentioned, some intuitive sense about the scale of change that's needed, the timing for the change, the readiness for the organization. So I would argue that all too often it happens because somebody is new, or because there's been a new idea that's been tossed into the wind. And the leader's responsibility in managing that change is to have some emotional, intuitive, contextual sense about the timing, the extent, the scale, and the readiness of people for the kind of change that's needed.
And if I could jump into a similar point back to Tim's point earlier, there has to be a rationale. Simply reorganizing because it looks nicer on a piece of paper is not a rationale that's going to sell to the individuals who are caught up in all of that. So what are we trying to accomplish? And can we get everybody on board with accomplishing that? And then the organizational pieces can fall into place.
Yeah.
So following up on that, is there a point when there becomes too much or too frequent change? I mean, at some point, won't people say enough is enough, and they look to wait out the change? They look to leave the organization. You know, you have a talent melt, or people will even start to undermine.
Oh yeah, absolutely. You know, at some point, it becomes the boy who cried wolf, and people stop running to support the leader when they're faked out enough on the importance of a change initiative. You know, I like Covey's old concept of an emotional bank account, which he used more to describe, you know, more of a one-on-one relationship. But leaders have that with their organizations. And each time a leader says to her organization, this is really important, this is critical to our success, even our survival as an organization, you know, she makes a significant withdrawal on that account, and it's not an endless reserve. So back to Loren's good point, you know, I think there's a set of emotional competencies there where the leader has to know when it really matters to make a significant change to her organization, and when the organization has had too much or isn't ready. Otherwise, that organizational bank account will be depleted very quickly.
So you've alluded to some of the issues, all of you, with organizational change and planning. Maybe we can go through each and have each one of you identify a few of the common barriers and mistakes that you've observed in your career, in your experiences. Let's start off with you, Loren.
I've never seen it go poorly. It's always been perfect. I guess barriers that come to mind, I've seen or known, wrong timing. Just because it's a leadership turnover may not mean it's the right time. There may be too much stress in the organization, to your point about frequency or readiness. So wrong timing is maybe a barrier. Too many goals in planning, too many objectives, too many aspirations, too many initiatives they collapse under their own weight. There can be a lack of focus, and people don't understand. Confusion sets in, or resistance or anxiety sets in. Plans or initiatives or reasons to change that are integrated. The connection between where we are and where we need to be doesn't make sense, or there's not an integration at an institution of higher education, for example, between the resources to accomplish the change that I've announced as a leader, or there's a disconnect between the academic imperative and the other aspects of the institution. So without resources or connection and not integration, it's very, very difficult to achieve things, and people become frustrated. And I suppose maybe a last one that occurs to me is change for reasons that might be considered dishonest. You know, Tim talks about this emotional bank account. When I announce a change or a leader announces a change, people want to believe, and for change to occur, you as a leader have to hope they believe. There has to be integrity in that change initiative, I think. So I would say those barriers occur to me: timing, goals, integration, and honesty.
All right, Beth.
I think one place where we sometimes fall down is we try to move it too fast. We don't get the right people on the bus, and that's one of the adages I use about just getting people on the bus, because it's a lot easier to wait and get the people on the bus than to try to back that bus up and in reverse and get the people back on it. So I think that's a big one. I think sometimes we don't marry the top down and the bottoms up. So a leader at the top might want certain things to occur and try to drive that, but that's out of sync with where the organization is. So there's not that readiness piece. Or conversely, there might be a bottoms up approach that they're trying, a grassroots approach to change that isn't consistent with the goals of the institutional leader. So how do you marry those two things along the way so that you're trying to forge that alignment?
Great. All right, Tim.
Yeah, Tony, I think one of the biggest mistakes leaders make in going about a change effort is going about it without being assured that they have meaningful engagement and buy-in from the organization to the change. And in my opinion, that's why most organizational change efforts fail, is passive resistance from the organization. I think a lot of leaders confuse the absence of active opposition to a change effort with the presence of buy-in, and they're not the same thing. The absence of active opposition means nothing. It means people are just kind of going along. And in fact, it's kind of counterintuitive for a lot of leaders, but the presence of some degree of active opposition, at least initially, is evidence of engagement. And a willingness of those around the leader to say, I have a different perspective, is absolutely a necessary condition for creating the kind of organizational support that takes it into a successful execution. So yeah, kind of failure to diagnose passive resistance.
So you've all alluded to this a little bit. When you can have the best plan in the world, right? But if you don't have trust and buy-in, and people don't believe it's for the right reason, or perhaps there's a hidden agenda, then most of the times you're likely to be unsuccessful. So Beth, can you speak to some of the issues of ethics, and how do you build organizational trust, and how do you maintain transparency throughout all these change and planning efforts?
You know, I think one of the first things that's absolutely necessary is grounding in the institutional values. I mean, every one of our campuses has its own organizational culture, its own way of knowing, its own way of doing, its own history, its own set of stakeholders, and all of those things have to be considered anytime that change is contemplated. And when you put it in that context, I think you are much more likely to get individuals to support what you're doing, because again, we're here to really, in our roles, we have the educational value of our roles, of course, but we're also here to help advance our institutions, many of them that are over more than 100 years old. How do we help advance them into the future so that they're here for the next generation of students? And you can't do that without recognizing the sense of history, pride, tradition, and getting that sense that those stakeholders overall on the bus with the change efforts.
Anyone else have anything to add to that?
You know, I just want to add one thing, if I could. I'm thinking a little bit about this issue of employee engagement and buy-in that Beth just mentioned, Tim was mentioning. And Tim mentioned earlier Cotter, which of course is a well-known thinker, writer around change. And there are others. There's Noster has a model for managing complex change, and William Bridges has written a great book on managing transitions. So the steps for change might be well articulated, if you will. What I think we're talking about a little bit is a leader's responsibility to manage the process of change. And I would argue, in fact, Bridges argues really that change and transition are two different things. The change is an event, it's an occurrence, it's a date on the calendar. Transition is all the stuff that follows, which must be attended to in the managing that transition process. So metaphorically, a change would be, I've moved to Albuquerque. Transition would be, it takes me the year it takes to learn the roads and find a new dentist and make friends and become comfortable there. And too many leaders think the change has been made and so everybody should get on board. And what happens, we know from the shock, anger, resistance, acceptance sort of curve. We know from Kubler-Ross's thoughts around death, we have a curve to acceptance. And Bridges talks about marking endings, moving through this neutral transition period to have and set a new beginning. And so I'm saying all that to say that this withdrawal or this resistance or confusion, anxiety are just normal parts of change in life, in an organization, and the leader's responsibility, at least in my view, being to attend to all facets of that. It will take longer than expected, and all of the ways people react to this, we know a little bit about, and they're all normal. And so a leader's job is to attend to all of that, is sort of my summary, I think, of what we've been talking about for 10 minutes or so.
Well, and change is about people. It's not about the organization, really. It's about the people, and you're leading the people to do something differently or to go a different direction than maybe what has been done in the past. And so when you put it in the context of the people, I think that allows us to kind of frame it in those ways.
Yeah, I agree.
So I want to back up for a moment, and Loren, maybe you can kind of step us through some of the basic steps in a traditional planning process. What happens along that curve as we advance toward change?
Well, as I mentioned, all of these folks have different ways to say what I would summarize as sort of 3 buckets, if you will, in which there are some steps. Plan readiness, plan development, and plan execution. Or change readiness, change development, and change execution, however you want to think about it. But those, to me, feel like the 3 buckets that they're all really talking about. And the plan readiness might be, Tim mentioned earlier, is there a reason for change? Has it been well articulated? Is it compelling? Is the leadership in place, as Beth was talking about earlier, is the leadership in place that can carry this all the way through? Is the mission clear? Are the values clear? So that as we're making decisions about what we do and what we don't do, that we do that throwing that up against our mission and values. So that would be readiness, I think. Is that understood? Plan development or change development would be making sure we're using the right data, the right filters to make decisions about where we need to be in the future. What kinds of changes are required? Do we have a timeline? Do we have metrics? Do we know when we're there? How do we know when we're there? Execution to me would be things like, do we have a structure to carry it out? Is there a transition team? Are there people who are responsible for aspects of it? Is there a scorecard? And does the scorecard, that is the metrics, the milestones, does it include everything from tangible, measurable things, as well as a culture and temperature check for the people in the organization, as Beth was getting at? How do we evaluate whether or not we are doing it the right way as well as doing what we need to do? So, to me, it's readiness, development, and execution with little pieces in there, regardless of the author or the thinker or the model that's really being deployed on a campus.
So you've all talked about change being about people. So I'd like to shift gears a moment and talk about the human toll that takes place with change. And most people I know prefer order and consistency and some degree of predictability. And the threat and uncertainty of change can often trigger, as you've all mentioned, anxiety, resentment, and even anger at times. And I imagine that there is this really wide continuum relative to people's ability to embrace and deal with change. And that can be based on their own history, their own perspective, or their life circumstances. You've all spoke about having some really good change experiences and maybe some not so good change experiences. So I know there's a lot here, but Tim, can you describe how as individuals we can better cope with change, and also as leaders, how do we better set up and present these opportunities without generating fear?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, first of all, Tony, I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and one of the most frequent reasons that I would see people when I was doing psychotherapy for a living was people coming in to deal with some kind of change, some kind of transition. It is difficult, as you referenced, and there's certainly a continuum, but there are a couple of consistent pieces in there with regard to how humans relate to change. One is we don't like change. As a species, right? We just don't like change. And secondly, some degree of pain always accompanies change efforts. So those are the two givens. I used to do some consulting work for a company that worked with a well-established retail operation who made a relatively simple change, right? They changed their colors. They changed their colors from yellow and brown to yellow and green. And what happened was the employees started to hoard the pencils and the pens that had the old yellow and brown. And they refused to use the new writing utensils that had the new colors. I mean, something as simple as changing your color scheme was passively resisted by the organization. And we see this all the time, in family systems work. Families seek homeostasis. It's not too different in organizations. Better the devil you know than the devil you don't. And most people would rather live in a system that's complicated and difficult than experience the discomfort of changing the system. So how can we better cope with change? A couple of quick things. We've been throwing out a bunch of recommendations for reading. Most of the people listening are probably familiar with the concept of a growth mindset and Carol Dweck's work out at Stanford. One of the most helpful ways that I've been able to help people deal with change is to adopt a growth mindset, to learn about the science of neuroplasticity and trust that doing things that are hard, that are different, that stretch our current skill set or force us to learn new skills actually creates long-term structural changes in our brain. It makes us more effective. It makes us smarter. And that incentive for going through this painful process, in my experience, is often enough for at least a good portion of us to cope effectively with change. I'll throw it back to you for time's sake. I can throw in another piece if you'd like.
Sure, go for it.
Okay. I think another way that many of us deal with change successfully is just by being insightful and introspective enough to be aware of our own fears about change and be willing to articulate those out loud. Dan Siegel wrote a great book called Brainstorm, which is really relevant to young adults and college students. And he loves this concept of name it to tame it. I think just by naming some of our concerns and our fears about what might happen if our organization changes, if our family changes, whatever the organizational framework is enough to help us hang in there. And the most emotionally intelligent leaders really support that process. They support the process of the people around them articulating their concerns, their fears, their anxieties, and having a supportive discussion about those things. That's how they get tamed. They're going to exert a lot of power one way or the other. So the smart leader is going to get them out on the table and talk about them and support people in managing those difficulties and those anxieties rather than pretending they're not there and therefore giving them more interference with the change effort.
So from a neurological perspective, it sounds like our brain becomes more rigid, right? As we grow older, it becomes much more difficult to embrace change, right? And I'm looking at the four of us who are up there in our years. So, right, it's kind of counterintuitive that you want leaders to embrace and promote change, but as we grow older, it seems like we are personally more resistant to change.
Well, you know what, Tony, that's there's some truth in that. But what we're actually finding from kind of the new science of brain development is that all of us, even into old age, have some degree of plasticity in our brains. When we challenge ourselves to learn something new, we're still potentiating. neurologically, and that's a really good news story. We didn't used to think that happened. Now, it doesn't happen as fast as it does for college students. It's not as quick, but it's still happening. I mean, I just turned 50, so I'm getting on that end of the spectrum, right? But I had a great experience. I used to hate foosball. Okay, I used to hate it, and I hated it because I was bad at it. That's a fixed mindset. I hated it. But my son bought a foosball table, and we play foosball together. And since I've learned about growth mindset, I forced myself to go down and play foosball with him. And you know what? I'm a darn good foosball player. And I can literally feel my brain. I'm not kidding. If you pay attention to it, you can feel the connections between your brain and your hand and your reflexes and your reactions. And I know that's a small, silly example, but more broadly, when people are having to go through painful change efforts, that's what we have to convince them of, is that their brains will change. They will become better, stronger, faster as a result. And even just selfishly, it's worth it, right? You're getting smarter and better in the process.
Right. So we've been talking about these change efforts, and from someone watching in who may look to be instituting organizational change or sees a need for change at their institution, they have some options. Hopefully they have some options. So Loren, can you talk about what we can do internally and what we can do externally to help us drive or plan our organizational change efforts?
Well, let me talk about this maybe as a person who's responsible for change. You know, one of the things that Tim is helping us understand is that we can get smarter about the change process. So for one, if I'm responsible for some change, certainly we want to make sure that the emotional intelligence is there, that the timing is right, that the leadership is there, that the resilience of the organization at least is ready for the things we can predict might be the case. But I think we can also get smarter about this. There are resources, there are people, there are groups, and there are colleagues that can help us learn a little bit about this process so that we're more skilled. And maybe, back to Tim's point, meanwhile, we're challenging ourselves and discovering our own fears in the process, because it is scary to go through change, at least in my experience, and it is scary to be responsible for change. And so when I have been responsible for change, usually the first thing that I have to get rid of is my own fear that I'm going to break it, that I'm responsible for it. I have to have enough courage, conviction, and compassion to actually lead it. So I think, you know, getting smarter about it for myself and for other people is really important. The other thing I want to mention is, you know, Tim and Beth and I and you really been talking about this process of change and what it's like for people. And the pencils example was beautiful, and I think we're probably all I'm going to try to go online and find out which company changed its colors to, you know. But
I changed the colors.
but you know, the past doesn't have to be wrong or broken for us to need the change. And so at some level, it seems to me as a leader, it would be responsible and compassionate to sit with people and honor the past, celebrate the past even. There are a lot of good people, good things, good initiatives that have brought us to where we are. The need to change doesn't mean something's broken or wrong. It might mean something's broken or wrong, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. And so what people are hanging on to is something they helped create, something that is comfortable, something that they've contributed to. And so, you know, I think it's really, really important as a leader to acknowledge that past, to honor it, and to you know, be a bit reverential for some of the ways we got where we are, so that the reason for change isn't what's broken, it's just where we need to be.
Well, and I think that ties to baby with the bathwater, right? We absolutely want to honor the past, and those pieces of the past that totally define us as an entity, as an organization, we absolutely continue to hold dear to us as we move forward for the future. And so finding ways to do that, I think, also helps in that space.
We got a question from Twitter from Nikki Dunham that kind of speaks to having leaders understand the impact, or I think, Tim, you mentioned it before, if you're not hearing anything, that's potentially a problem too. If you're not getting any resistance, that's potentially a problem with getting feedback. So Nikki asks, how can those of us at the quote bottom of the organizational chart challenge our leaders to make the considerations that you've been mentioning?
Wow. That's a great question. You know, I think I wish I had a better answer to this, but Nikki, I think, you know, if you're in an organization where you don't feel like you can trust what would happen if you were supportively honest about your feelings or your concerns about a change initiative, you know, all of us have to think about person-organization fit and whether that's a good fit for you as a person. What I would love to be able to do is be, you know, coaching the leader of an organization where people don't feel like they can say, hey, I've got a better idea or a different idea, or I have a perspective that might be helpful as we go about this change effort. So you have to think about it, you know, you're in the right organization. As leaders, though, we have to be 100% sure that, I hope I've got her name right, Nikki, we've got to be 100% sure that in our organization, most people are afraid to speak up. Like, you have to work from that basic proposition. Whenever there is power, there's anxiety. Leaders have power. It, for better or worse, cascades anxiety into the organization unless the leader has the emotional intelligence to look for it and to weaken it and to promote an environment of trust whereby she can model humility and openness and a true desire to hear from the Nickies of the organization, because that's the only way that they're going to speak up.
I might add one thing to Nikki's question too, and to Tim's response, and that is a good leader, I believe, if I was coaching somebody myself, I would say there's two things that would be helpful in this situation. One is to structure the ways to hear from staff, and the other is to signal symbolically hearing from staff. Both of those are important. So structuring, whatever that is for your organization that is culturally relevant, but it might be finding the Nickies and the others who don't feel like they have as much power and meeting regularly in a structured way so that that feedback is frequent, current, and immediate, without a lot of filters. But symbolically also making sure that what's signaled to people is, I want to hear you. I care about how it feels to go through this. I would say, and I appreciated Tim saying this, Nikki and other people are worthy of an organization where that is possible. That's a healthy organization. And if it's not possible to speak up and say, I'm anxious about this, or I have a better idea, as Tim said, you know, it is the case sometimes that we have to make a change so that our health and our work life is productive and happy and mutual. And so it feels like the last resort, but that's an important consideration too, if it's not a place, an environment where I can speak up about how it feels or what ideas I have.
Hey, Tony, can I keep building on that, or do you want to move on?
Yeah, no, go ahead. We've got some time.
So, you know, one of the concepts that I think we've been talking around that in my theoretical background we refer to as confluence. It's going along to get along. It's actually a psychological defense in organizations where people just kind of want to deliver to appear like they're bought in, and they're not. It's just it's a way to reduce kind of the tension between the person and the organization. And one of the most skilled examples I've ever seen of a leader managing that was, and I appreciated what Loren said, it's a super important point that you have to have structures for this to ever have an opportunity for the information to flow up to the leader. That's huge. So thank you for mentioning that. But you know, in the context of one of these situations where a leader was seeking feedback, he was running into confluence, and people just kind of, yeah, sounds great, you know, slapping him on the back. And he said, no, I need to hear something from everyone in this room that you're concerned about with this initiative. Nothing. Gets no response. No, I need to hear anything. Let's say, in your imagination, if you had a concern, what would it be? And there was still some hesitance. And actually what he got down to is the level of, tell me something about my outfit or what I have on that you don't like today. And one person said, I don't like your glasses. You know, and that was like a breakthrough. That's engagement, right? But he had to work that hard to get down to something digestible for this group of people to say something they didn't like. Now we can start to have a conversation. But that's the amount of work that it takes to get through that kind of organizational defense of confluence.
I like it. I've talked about this with some groups over the past few years. Leaders often come in and say, hey, I've been thinking about this problem or this issue, and I have this great idea. You know, what do you think about it, right? And they've already determined the value of the idea, right? They've said, it's my idea, it's a great idea. Like, who would dare challenge the value of that? And instead going in with the mindset of saying, hey, I have an idea. What's wrong with it? As you said, poke some holes in it. How can I make it better? And having the comfort level and the confidence to go in and say that and get that kind of feedback, I think is an important issue, as you've all pointed out. It looks like we lost Beth. Beth, are you out there? Hopefully she'll rejoin us here. So I'll direct.
Loren can take all of her questions.
I'm sure you can both handle it. So without a sensible mission and mission, as you've discussed, to help us align and direct and inspire actions, particularly with large numbers of folks, actions can often dissolve into this list of confusing, incompatible, and often time-consuming projects that either go in the wrong direction or go no place at all. Now, on the other hand, vision and mission statements, from my experiences, can often turn into these time-intensive, creative writing exercises, sometimes day-long retreats that wind up sitting on a shelf somewhere collecting dust. What do you both think about that? Where's the balance? Yes.
The answer is yes. Tim, what do you?
Well, I'll just say that I've lived on both sides of this. I think the more responsibility you have for the organization, I think the more helpful mission statements are. I have found myself as a leader going back to mission statements and honestly finding guidance, literally helping me to clarify my own thinking and our own values and priorities as an organization that have helped me make good decisions for the organization around me. I think the less power you have in an organization, the more ridiculous the effort feels, the more painful it feels, and the more likely it is to sit on your shelf. So mission statements are really important. I mean, they're the punchline of a lot of organizational jokes, but they're really important. I think as a leader, it's critical though that people are really engaged around the development of mission statements, so that they not only make a difference to the CEO or the president or the vice president, but that they really do have tangible daily meaning to the people at the lower rungs of the organization, so that they can get out the mission statement. I'm struggling with something. What would be best for the organization from the standpoint of what we're trying to do together? So those are my thoughts. Loren, any thoughts to add?
Yeah, I was smiling to myself because when I was in graduate school, I had a faculty member once tell me, never say in a sentence what you could write in a paragraph. So we're sort of brought up in this academic environment to elaborate and to source and to really think about it. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's good and important, and what makes writing and thinking and compelling and strong. I agree with Tim. Mission is really important. In fact, it is the first step back to what steps of a planning process or a change process, affirming, getting clarity on that mission, but not in a paragraph. I mean, or 3 pages or a document. I mean, really getting clear on that mission, and the nuances matter. So it's one thing to say, to serve students to the best of our ability or something like this. That's a little weak, but to spend time talking about, well, what students most need us, and does timing matter, and how do we do that? I mean, just to really, really wrestle with that, because that short parsimonious mission, if used well, I believe will guide lots of decisions. It will tell us something about what we will not do as much as what we will do. It will tell us something about how we hire. It will tell us something about the characteristics we use to evaluate performance and leadership and contribution. So a great mission statement, I think, is fundamentally important. It should deserve some time, but it should be parsimonious so that it liberates staff. Otherwise, if you have to work to remember it and can't really tell what we mean by that, it becomes a little bit problematic. But a good mission statement with values infused into it will liberate all of us to just do our work really, really well and serve and contribute in a way that makes sense.
You know, and Tony, I'll make our founder, Mr. Jefferson, very proud by giving UVA a pat on the back. You know, UVA's mission statement is really brief. I think it's 3 or 4 sentences long. And so when I was pitching an initiative to our board of visitors a couple of years ago, and it was such a piece of cake to say, this is important from the standpoint of our mission as a university, because it's so clear. There's not that much in it, and therefore every word has more meaning, to Loren's point. Now the initiative didn't end up going anywhere. That's my fault, not the mission statements. But the point is that the mission statement itself was so helpful in even being able to talk about it in a way that the people I was trying to convince could fully consider this initiative. The mission statement was a real asset, and it was because it is so darn brief.
And one last thing, if I could too, a good mission statement, I think, Tony, back to this point about the anxiety that is natural with change, and Tim's point about as humans we don't like change. A good mission statement, if we've affirmed it together, created it together, I think can go a long ways to help people see that who we are maybe isn't going to change. How we get there, what the milestones are, how long it takes might change, but we believe what we believe together. I think a good mission statement can go a long ways to helping us feel like we're in something together here and we all understand it and agree with it.
Yep.
I like it. And it sounds like you're both pushing towards something that is distinctive about each institution, right? That in the end is helping you make decisions on a day-to-day basis.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I've always been fascinated by the intricacies of intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. And I found in my experience in day-to-day leadership that it's much less about exerting power and authority than it is about empowering other folks, right? It's about pulling people rather than pushing them. And you don't necessarily do this through speeches, strategic vision, or efficient management. At least I've found you do it by teaching, by coaching, and by helping other people to be successful, to help them excel. So Tim, what, if any, is the distinction and the relationship between leadership and management?
Well, I mean, the way I think of it, Tony, managers execute, leaders set direction. We mentioned Cotter a couple of times already. The way he describes it is that management makes a system work, but leaders build new systems or transform old ones. One of my past experiences was as a manager at Procter & Gamble, and what they're trying to do at Procter & Gamble is develop those of us who are managers into leaders. And we got asked the question all the time: how are you putting your signature on this organization? That's a leadership question. How will the organization be different 5 years from now because you were here, even if you're gone? That's a leadership question. Managers go execute it. In terms of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, it's also a distinction that I enjoy thinking about and talking about, Tony. We see this in primary school all the time, when a teacher thinks that giving rewards or stars to students creates motivation. That's just not the case. What creates motivation for kids is the same thing that creates motivation, intrinsic motivation, for the rest of us. It's an internally derived reward system. It's getting personal pleasure from doing high quality work. It's having some sense of control over how I do the work that I do and experiencing a sense of competence while I'm doing it. Those are the factors that will always outmuscle pay or benefits in terms of creating, sustainable motivation. In fact, there's research that when you pay someone at least to do like physical tasks, the motivation goes down, right? It actually diminishes it because it tends to dampen the intrinsic motivation that's much more powerful and sustainable in all of us.
Yeah, I might just add my own 2 cents. I agree with everything Tim said, so this is additive more than anything. But I kind of think of managers as implementing and leaders as responsible for the health of the whole. That said, I want to make sure I'm clear too that we need both in all organizations. Sometimes I think in higher education, maybe especially, we in the process of trying to help people understand the importance of good leadership, we sometimes can accidentally, I think, make management or managerial capability seem to be something less than, and really shouldn't be. We need all ways to work in an organization, but the leader's responsibility is to, as Tim said, build the system, ask the right questions. I think take responsibility for the whole health of the organization and the whole success of the organization, and we also need good managers and folks in the organization who will implement, who will contribute in ways that make those systems and those questions and answers and the health of the organization real.
Great.
Yeah, well said and important. Yeah.
So we got a question earlier in the episode that's relative to this. Jessica Clark from NE, and that could be Nebraska or Northeastern, I'm not quite sure. She asked, do you see a value in spending a concentrated effort into building flexibility into an organization versus constant reorganization? So instead of organizational planning and reorganizing, would we be better off improving the capacity to seek, to critically assess, and selectively incorporate the new ideas and practices, not just during organizational change time, but all the time?
Yeah.
Yes.
I have a thought, Tim, but do you want to go, or do you want me to?
You can jump in, Loren. I can.
Yeah, I think it's a great and really, really intuitive question. The answer is yes. Adaptive leadership, I think, is something we need to learn, all of us, to lead in higher education, to manage in higher education, as folks entering higher education, and as institutions themselves. So there's a lot of research. I would encourage viewers to look up on adaptive leadership, but it's essentially being smart enough, intuitive enough, well read and researched enough to know what parts of the organization are undeniably fixed and important, and what parts can change and be thrown away as conditions or circumstances or needs change. And that is a certain kind of hiring. We might think about job descriptions. Do our HR departments, do we have fixed ways to search and train and hire people? Or can we think about ways in our HR systems, for example, where though we can build in adaptive change, build in flexibility, to use the point made, into job descriptions? Can we think about the skills and training and professional development that we have that will teach those skills? It's going to become increasingly necessary, much faster, and I think we have to challenge the structures we have in education that actually perpetuate and recreate fixed solutions, fixed structures, even the fixed job descriptions, silos, and department lines we use to manage a very large, in many cases, organization that don't necessarily line up to respond to student needs and other needs on campus. So it's long-winded, I'm sorry, but it is the punchline being, yes, I think flexibility should be built in, and the skills, training, and systems that we have need to be challenged in that regard.
And it's critical now. I mean, there's, we can't get too attached to any particular goal or change initiative, because it's not an exaggeration to say that in a lot of industries, it's irrelevant 6 months from now. And so having objectives that are revisitable and revisable, and goals that you're willing to go back and reconsider and change ongoing is critical in this economy. And that creates a tension with what we talked about earlier, which is not draining the emotional bank account of your organization with too much change. And I cannot give Jessica advice on how to resolve that tension, but that is a tension.
So we've gotten, I'm going to go out with one more question before we get to a final wrap up with resources. We've got two questions that came from Twitter about this, and it's about guidance on leading organizational change at institutions that are different, right? Different institutional type and size. So what are some of the factors when it comes to planning at a small institution, at a private institution, large, and all the other in between?
Tim, you first this time.
Well, change is difficult no matter where you are. I think though when you're dealing with less organizational girth, it's easier to drive change as a small team, maybe even as an individual, although I don't think so. In large organizations, it's more critical that you build that powerful coalition. Loren and I have both worked at big schools. We went to school at big schools, Big Ten schools. We've worked at Big Ten schools. At institutions those size, no matter how charismatic or powerful a leader is, there's no such thing as just making up my mind and expecting people to follow. It will not happen. So building that coalition of 8, 10, 12, 14 powerful people around you and spending whatever it takes, spending a month, 6 months, 8 months, developing the cohesion and the buy-in around the initiative before you take it out into the organization is much more critical at larger schools.
Yeah, I would say different types of institutions makes that mission conversation we just had really important. The mission should be different. That's the great thing about this country is the variety and types of institutions that serve our communities. And so a 2-year is different than a 4-year, private, parochial, religiously affiliated. All those missions are so important that any kind of change effort and transition effort should be built on clarity and commitment to that mission. So we've hit that a few times, but I think that's one example of why that's so important.
Right.
The other thing I would say as a person sort of thinking about change is having enough data. That might be contextual data or economic data or societal data or learning data to know whether or not that mission that you have for the place is being fulfilled well. What's that gap? That gap should tell us something about that scale of change or the timing of change that's needed. So, different institutional types will have different data and different missions, and I think that's really important to understand before implementing or participating in a change initiative.
Right. So in 30 seconds or less, I'd like each of you, if you have any resources that you can share with the audience, whether it be websites, books, conferences, and you mentioned quite a few books here, and we'll try and tweet them out if we haven't already, that can help the audience continue to learn about some of the topics that we've discussed here today. Tim, you want to start us off?
Yeah. So the author that Loren and I both mentioned is John Cotter, who's at Harvard, and a book I would recommend relative to this topic is called Leading Change. And he has an 8-step kind of almost formulaic approach to organizational change that I think it's a great book. One I want to mention that we hadn't brought up yet is another little UVA plug, but a business professor up at our Darden School of Business wrote a book just this summer, came out, called Humility is the New Smart. And it's by Ed Hess. And, we have talked about humility a lot in this session without really naming it as such. Much of what we've discussed isn't possible if a leader is not coming at this organizational change endeavor with humility, with an interest in listening, with an interest in willingness to be wrong, to say, I need you, I need input, I can't do this without the people around me, and really mean it. And I'm just gonna say this about my friend Loren, having worked with him. He does this as well as anybody I've ever seen. So if you are interested in seeing that modeled, spend some time with Loren.
Thank you. Thanks. I'll mention, I know time is short, Managing Transitions by William Bridges. Great book. Speaks to a leader's responsibility and what it feels like as a member of an organization. Great book. A student affairs resource I might mention is Strategic Planning in Student Affairs by Dr. Shannon Ellis at Nevada, Reno. Speaks to the steps and some of the practical aspects of implementing. Certainly ACPA and other student affairs higher ed associations offer institutes and resources. Let me offer one that sometimes folks don't always think about, particularly in the student affairs area, and that is the Society for College University Planning, SCUP, has a planning institute, which is a 3-part institute that really does with integrated planning, which is all aspects of the university. So I might mention that as a resource. And then finally, I would say I have found, as Tim just mentioned, fabulous resources where we don't expect them, sometimes across campus. In the business school, in the provost's office. Sometimes provost office are responsible for institutional planning, budget planning. So there are great colleagues on our campuses, and just a little bit of research sometimes reveals them too.
Excellent. Well, I'm sorry we lost Beth along the way. Hopefully everything's okay at Purdue. Thank you, everyone, for sharing your wisdom and your perspectives. I love that we have such a range of perspectives that you provided, and the resources. And as I said, I'll actually put those links up on the episode website so that people can go back and share them with others. Heather Shea will be back next week to discuss student affairs as a career path and how to best search for a higher education or student affairs graduate program. You can receive reminders about this and other great shows by subscribing to the Higher Ed Live newsletter. You can also browse the archives at higheredlive.com or subscribe to our iTunes podcast. I'm Tony Doody. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you make it a great week, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.